Iran started this, and Iran just became a worse threat because our responses to them were appeasing and accommodating. And that is a moral failure for decades. Then 9/11 comes along.
Welcome back to
Ami's house.
Okay, with us today we have the Objectivist Round Table, finally bringing some insight, knowledge, dare I say, expertise onto a conversation where there's been very little of it. We're going to talk all things Iran. With us, we have Yaron Brook and Elan Journo. I discovered them both through the Ayn Rand Institute, and I'd like to welcome you, first of all, both to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, a lot of people, it's very fashionable now to be talking about the Middle East, to be talking about Iran and Israel. Everyone on Twitter, everyone and their mother has a comment or an opinion about it. But you two both and have been sounding the alarm about Iran for a very, very long time. And in this conversation, for decades, and in this conversation, what I want to do is really unpack Iran and explain why Iran has been a threat to the U.S., both to the U.S. and to Israel, and what justifies military intervention. And I'd love to get into that and explain the rational justification for it. Before we do, just to zoom out a little bit, I know that objectivists really resent comparisons to libertarians, but there's been kind of two opposing narratives and interesting voices, especially in the online space. You have sort of the reactionary neoconservative traditional position on war, and then you have your libertarian isolationist position, which has been kind of ascendant. I've been seeing it and become kind of in vogue. You have like Scott Horton, Dave Smith positions about this. So oftentimes I know libertarianism and objectivism get compared to each other because there are similarities with certain economic and domestic policies. But if you could, I'll feel it to your own first, just some of the main differences on foreign policy between sort of the libertarian isolation position and objectivism.
Well, first, there is no such thing as an isolationist position. It's a defeatism and surrenderism position, right? Mm-hmm. It basically views, the libertarian position is basically a position that views all the problems in the world as having originated from the United States or from a place like Israel or Western Europe. That is, their view fundamentally is that because they are grounded in an anarchist ideology, their view is fundamentally is any state that is decent and good it has to be pulled down in order to justify the anarchism. And indeed, any state that's evil and bad, well, that's okay because that's what we expect states to be. That's what they're supposed to be. So Iran, Russia, those are just regular states. It's the West and Israel that have to be evil in order for them to be able to rationalize their position vis-a-vis anarchy and the hatred. And you see this going all the way back to Murray Rothbard, who, thought that Stalin, Soviet Union, and the United States were moral equals, or, Stalin was actually a little bit better, would raise a toast every time an American plane would be shot down over Vietnam and viewed the North Vietnamese as the good guys and even though they were communists. You'd think a libertarian would oppose communism, but no. So fundamentally, they approach everything from this perspective of any decent state has to be bad. And I hear it all the time from them. The worst state in history is the United States. Mm-hmm. They have caused all the wars. They are problematic everywhere. They violate more rights than anybody else. And Israel, of course, is follows right along there as part of that. So objectivism takes a very different approach. Objectivism, first of all, is not anarchist. We believe in government. We believe in strong government, a government who has one job, and that is protecting individual rights. And in that context, everything in foreign policy has to fit into that. What do we have to do vis-a-vis the rest of the world in order to protect the individual rights of Americans or of Israelis, depending on which country you're talking about? So it's all from the perspective of protecting individual rights, protecting the life and property of and freedom and liberty of the people that you are the government of, and that actually requires you to recognize the fact that there are countries that are better at protecting rights, not perfect, none of them are, that are better at protecting rights, i.e., the United States, Israel, and they're countries that have no semblance of any protection of rights: Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. I mean, there's a bunch of them, right? So there are, in this context, good guys and bad guys, and morally good countries, those that protect protect rights even though they're flawed, and those who have no semblance of that protection, and that makes them evil.
That's really interesting that you point that out on almost a psychological level, because if the anarchist premise is all statism is equally bad, then the worst actors that manifest that in the form of a North Korea or whatever, it doesn't offend them as much as the existence of a state that they may have to concede is better at protecting individual rights, that there's varying degrees here, because they almost will not criticize the true representations of what they deem statism to be.
And it's not so much psychological as it is ethical, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing they won't do is say this country's good, this country's evil. They don't want to make that. I mean, they're all subjectivists. Mm-hmm. It's whatever they feel like, and that's important. We strive for moral objectivity. That is, we have a standard of morality, human life, and you evaluate what is morally good versus what is morally bad by the standard of individual human life.
Mm-hmm. Now, Elan, if you could continue along the lines on how that manifests in the terms of foreign policy. So the libertarian is not maybe isolationist, but it's surrenderist, or it doesn't believe in states at all. But as it pertains to the individual right to self-defense, how does that extend to the state's right to defend its citizens in the form of foreign policy that does intervene at times?
For sure. It's an extension of the same principle. So as individuals, we have a moral right to live, and we have a moral right to defend ourselves in extreme emergency situations. In a rational society where our individual rights are protected, what that means is that we've delegated that moral right to an agency, the government, that takes up a monopoly on the use of force. And we do that because that creates the opportunity for the objective rule of law implementation of that right. Mm-hmm. And we need that because we certainly don't want an anarchy. We don't want competing governments. And so that is a crucial role of the government. It's a moral responsibility to protect our individual rights. So that we understand, we have a police, we have a law system. All of that is the expression of our right to life and our, therefore, liberty and our right to defend ourselves. The role of government with respect to foreign threats is really just taking that and extending it to different sources of threat. So if it's a threat for someone to break into my house and steal my property or to harm me, and the government's right to step in, which it is, it's similar in kind to a foreign country tries to attack us, harm us, take our property, take our land. And that's the same role of government. So it's still the protection of individual rights, but with respect to foreign threats. And there's a lot to do to think about what is a foreign threat? How do you relate to other countries? And as Yaron was pointing out, it's not the case that every country in the world is a perfect embodiment of a free society. Many countries are mostly free. Some of them are partly free. Some of them are not free, and they're not trying to be free. And there's dictatorships, and you have to think about that. I would isolate one thing from what Yaron said and really emphasize it, because you're asking for points of contrast between objectivism and libertarianism on this kind of issue, political and foreign policy. Yaron was pointing out that the difference is essentially moral or ethical. I would emphasize that very strongly. I think this is an essential difference. Objectivism strives for identifying, based on the facts, what is morally right, morally wrong, what is a good society, what is a bad society. And here, the standard, the benchmark, or the yardstick maybe is a better term, is how well does a country uphold individual rights? And as Yaron was saying, many countries are mixed, and I think Israel and the United States are basically free, and there's problems with them. And a big part of my job, big part of Yaron's work is to criticize good countries for failing to be fully free and fully good. However, there is a night and day moral difference between a country that is trying to live up to a moral ideal that's the right moral ideal, and countries, and there are many of them, that are not even trying. that their whole purpose for being is to subjugate people, to crush them, to enslave them. And that's what Iran is. That's what Russia is. That's what China is. That is what North Korea is. And then many, many others in the Middle East that are like that. And that identification, that reality is part of what has to shape one's moral thinking in foreign policy. So the other way to put Yaron's point about the difference in moral, the role of morality in foreign policy and how it shapes our view, and by contrast, what's missing in libertarian and other schools of thought too, is that is a crucial way of thinking about what foreign policy is about. And there's a huge responsibility for anyone formulating foreign policy, implementing foreign policies, to think, what are we dealing with here? So it can't be true let's just take one example. Let me make up an example. Well, maybe you'll recognize this. Suppose you think that Putin's Russia is a fascist dictatorial regime, which I think it is. It's moving more and more towards that dictatorial path. That is real. That you have to recognize that fact. It's a bad place. It has militant ambitions. We've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen that in other places. You can't ignore that fact if you're taking seriously the responsibility of upholding individual rights in foreign policy. But what happens if you say, oh, no, Putin's a great guy and Russia's our friend and we want to be friendly with them? What does that do? So there's consequences. I hope you recognize what I'm referring to.
And we get along very well.
Yeah, exactly.
We get along so well.
And again, this is a very significant issue. So ignoring the moral character of other countries, or not even trying to figure that out, is a liability, and worse than a liability in many cases. And I think if you want to tie this to Iran, which I know is the topic of our, the history of America's reactions to Iran, history of American policy, if you want to call it policy towards Iran, is we don't think about the moral character. We evade it, or we whitewash it. And that is one reason we are in this horrendous situation with Iran on the brink, apparently within weeks of getting a nuclear device. I don't know exactly where they were, but it was close enough.
Right. Well, yeah, so on the subject of Iran, which is going to be the main substance of what we're going to dive into, can you now make the case then, in terms of there's always been this posturing of like people who are anti-war, which is a really meaningless proclamation because no one is really anti-war and no one is pro-war. It depends on which war. Some you're anti, some you're pro, depending on the standards. You both can comment on this, but Elan, in Winning the Unwinnable War, you famously in this chapters talk about, when I was reading it, being anti the Iraq war, but being pro Iran being identified as the threat post 9/11. So how does Iran meet the standard of intervention, military intervention, in a way that Iraq didn't? Because I do think the isolationists are making an interesting case where they're saying it's flawed, but they're saying because these previous military entanglements and engagements were wrong, so is Iran, without actually applying without actually applying any nuance to the situation or distinction.
I can understand people's reactions to Iraq and Afghanistan and their view. The best, more charitable view of this is, look at what happened in Iraq, look what happened in Afghanistan. Who could possibly want to replay that movie? It was a horror movie. It was a fiasco, and maybe that's even being too kind to what happened. My reaction is, you have to understand why those were fiascos and what was the right response after 9/11. And this is something the Institute, the Ayn Rand Institute, has been really vocal about. And weeks after 9/11, actually days after 9/11, we published a full-page ad in the New York Times and the Washington Post arguing that the target and what should have been the target after 9/11 and before was Iran and not other of these targets. So I would break this down as follows. The reason to think Iran as the primary threat is to understand Iran as the wellspring, the source, the financial and spiritual source of the Islamist movement. So when people think of 9/11, they think Al-Qaeda. That is not wrong. Al-Qaeda is part of the Islamist movement. But it should be understood that the Islamist movement is a kind of umbrella term that includes Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic State, and principally the Iranian regime. And I would put Saudi Arabia in here too, but it's a different kind of case. So the Islamist movement is predicated on the idea of enforcing Islamic religious law as a total system wherever they can exert their power. And we saw that under Islamic State. We saw that in Afghanistan under the Taliban. We see it in Iran since 1979. So the history of America and Iran started this after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they took the U.S. embassy. That's an act of war. They took American diplomats hostage. Again, act of war. And America's response to that was far, far from adequate. And Ayn Rand actually famously said, if we didn't go to march on them days after this aggression, we would take us years to live this down. And she was right. We haven't lived it down. And Iran just became a worse threat because our responses to them were appeasing and accommodating. And that is a moral failure for decades. Then 9/11 comes along. And what is 9/11 if not the reverberations of the Iranian Revolution that brings Islamic totalitarianism to power in one country and ignites a worldwide movement in the belief that, look, they managed to take over Iran. There is no limit to what we can do. They punched the United States in the face. They gave a black eye to the world's most powerful regime. There is no limit to what we can do. And you see Islamists, not all of them Shia, not all of them in Iran, everywhere in Senegal, in the Middle East, all over the world thinking, all right, the dawn has come. It's time for jihad. And this supercharges a movement that was prior to that not really a salient factor in the sense of believing they could accomplish anything. Hamas, for example, originated from an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And their strategy was it was a generational cultural revolution. And eventually we'll do jihad when everything's ready. And then what did they realize in the 1980s? Look at Iran. We're ready now. Let's spin off Hamas. We're ready to go to war. And so what happens after 9/11 is that whole intellectual aspect of the problem, like the nature of the enemy is being driven by these ideas, that is ignored and evaded and dropped out of the picture. And all we get is, we have to go after the Taliban because they hosted al-Qaeda. That is true. I certainly think that was right. But that misses the essence of the problem, which is you have a regime that is chanting death to America, painting that on missiles, marching in the street and telling the world, we're going to kill them over and over and over and over. And what do you do about that? You make friends with them. That is what led to 9/11. That paved the road to 9/11. And that was a bipartisan failure. And then after 9/11, it just got worse and worse because the response was, we're not going after the actual source of the problem. We're going after Iraq, which has no direct relationship either to 9/11 or to the Islamist movement. Saddam Hussein was a basically secular dictator who used religion as a cover for justifying a lot of his evils. And we go after the Taliban, which we let them slip through our fingers because we were just not really serious about going after the threat. So to me, I can understand why people think, we don't want another Iraq. We don't want another Afghanistan. But you have to understand why those were policy failures, not military failures. They're not discrediting of military force. They're discrediting of irrational ideas that we held and cowardice, moral cowardice, which I think was at the essence of America's foreign policy after 9/11. We do not want to talk about Islam as the source of this problem. You think about what George W. Bush said. Islam is a religion of peace. It's been hijacked by bad people. That is not true. It doesn't mean every Muslim is a threat, but it certainly means that there's a religious core to Islamic totalitarianism. And we didn't want to talk about it.
And because this was ideologically driven and inspiring the connection and of the culprit of 9/11 and Iran being implicated in that, is that this movement was inspired and spread by them across this part of the world to see America as weak and therefore attackable. And that's the connection?
Yeah, for sure. There's actual aggression. So I mentioned the attack on the U.S. embassy, but that didn't stop at taking hostages. And fortunately, they weren't harmed in sort of physical sense. They were psychologically tortured. Then what you have through the 1980s is Iranian proxies, principally Hezbollah in Lebanon, not only taking Americans hostage, but then exploding car bombs, suicide bombs at the American embassy, and then blowing up U.S. barracks with 244 Americans and several, I think a dozen or so French troops. Now, if those are not acts of war, I don't know what is. And that was what happened after that. Yeah. I think Reagan said, we'll go after you. And then they evacuate from Lebanon. It's essentially repeating the same lesson of not standing up for America's interests, or not defending Americans and retaliating against that aggression repeatedly. And who takes the lesson there? So the lesson of Lebanon, where America retreated after the bombing of the barracks and the embassy, that is something Osama bin Laden looked at. And he wrote about this. You can read it in Osama bin Laden's letters in his declaration, well, yeah, look what those idiots did in Lebanon. Their soldiers are weak. And that was inspiring to someone like him. And so there's direct connections between actual Iranian aggression. So they've been at war with us for decades and we haven't admitted it. That's the way to think of it. And then by the fact that we didn't retaliate, it only encouraged the Islamist movement even more.
Right. So it's interesting because I think it's a matter of people having short memories rather than being able to make a case, where this has been going on longer. And because there wasn't an immediate, in the past, recent memory, direct attack from Iran on U.S. soil, people have trouble understanding them as an aggressor. I just want to move on to one.
I really don't think it's memory, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I really don't think it's not like in the 1980s they were going after, we should do something because they're attacking us, or right after 9/11 there wasn't any. It's a lack of any kind of thought around the importance of ideology. And it's a lack of confidence in our own abilities, in own worthiness to actually go out and fight for ourselves. I mean, who are we? We're a rich country. Life's pretty good. Why are we even getting involved in the Middle East? Yeah, they're killing Americans, but there's a reason for that. You can find a million rationalizations, excuses for why they might have done that. But it's our own weakness. It's our own, the fact that we don't remember is a consequence of the fact that we don't want to remember. And we don't want to remember because that would require us to take action. And the last thing we want to do is actually take action that's assertive and self-interested. And because that would deem it immoral and wrong and we'll do anything to avoid being perceived as too self-interested.
I guess I'm referring more to the.
Sorry,
Sure,
I'm trying to jump in with something there, because earlier you said you wanted to relate this to the libertarian and maybe the neocon view, but I would say there's a uniform premise that many people in foreign policy have, and in some cases it leads them to disregard moral thinking altogether, which is sort of the isolationists, as you call them, or the defeatists, as Yaron calls them, and some libertarians. And then there's the neocon view, which takes it as no, we have a moral duty to save the world and police the world. And in both cases, both rejecting morality and embracing it and making it kind of a crusade, which is what we saw under George W. Bush with the so-called and really badly named Freedom Crusade, forward strategy of freedom, the democracy crusade. What unites them is a view of morality that is self-destructive. And this is what Ayn Rand called altruism. And most people's view of altruism is it's just being nice to people, helping people who are suffering. That is not what it means. And what it means is going to war and telling your soldiers that they cannot fight to win. They have to look at the mosque and not shoot because it's a mosque, and they have to hold back their fire. It's essentially a self-sacrificial premise. And it also means we're not going to act against the principal source of this threat, Iran. This is Iran's point about this would be too self-assertive. How dare we assert our right to defend ourselves? That, if you wanted to peel back the onion, what is really hampering America and also Israel in their acts of self-defense when they need to act in self-defense? What leads them to ignore the aggression? What leads them to appease? It's this moral premise. And I think this is, and it's essential to the work that I've been doing, both analyzing Iran and Israel and America's foreign politics. This is the unrecognized poison that is sabotaging America's foreign policy, and it's undercutting our lives. We shouldn't be in a position where we have to figure out how to stop Iran's nuclear program. This could have been solved decades ago when this program was exposed and validated. It's just been getting worse and worse. And why is it been getting worse? It's not because we lack military power. We could have done this level of military action 10 times over with the amount of bombs we dropped in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the refusal to act in our own self-interest. And it's a refusal even to conceive of what would our self-interest look like here.
When does that begin, a refusal to act in our self-interest?
In American
Is that
history?
in the 50s and the 60s? And what prompted that? Because we weren't always like that.
Well, I think it certainly begins in the post-World War II era. But the confusion about this goes back a long way. I mean, since the progressive era in America and in the post-Civil War period, I think that this altruistic view has spread at our universities and our schools, and I think Christianity reinforces it. Christianity, which says love your neighbor as yourself, or that says turn the other cheek, or love your enemy. all of that just reinforced what the progressives were teaching, this altruism, this self-sacrificial, America's nothing special. It shouldn't present itself as such. You could argue World War I, America's participation in World War I as an act of altruism. Was there really any self-interest in the United States going into World War I? I mean, Europeans were killing each other, but it wasn't like, there was a threat to the United States during that war. There wasn't. And indeed, there was a backlash against that. I mean, there was very similar to the backlash against Iraq and Afghanistan. But after World War I, the backlash was more, why did we go into this war? What was the purpose? It wasn't that we didn't win, we won. But what was the point? And then, in a sense, World War II is an aberration. World War II is the one war where the United States actually stood up. And maybe part of it is that it was, first of all, attacked on its own soil. Second, the enemy was so clearly, unequivocally evil that everybody kind of saw it, or almost everybody saw it. And then as soon as the war was over, as soon as the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki fell, immediately guilt kicks in. Immediately people start condemning the bombing of Dresden and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the unconditional surrender that was required of Germany and Japan at the time. And the altruism kicks in, and we get involved in a war in Korea, which is not clearly in our self-interest and is under the ban of the UN. Get involved in the war in Vietnam that Ayn Rand criticized. Was really critical of, because it wasn't clear there was our self-interest, and a lot of kids died for nothing in the end over there. And again, the country drew from those wars a lesson of, well, maybe we should stay out of stuff. We do these horrible wars. And then Iraq and Afghanistan, which in many ways are much more like Vietnam than they are of a proper war. And so altruism makes this all worse, because altruism makes it impossible for you to win. Yeah. And then when you don't win, people conclude, then we shouldn't intervene. And then it kind of cycles like that. But it's all driven ultimately by a morality.
It sounds like you have these two reactionary movements, both driven by self-sacrifice and altruism, a neoconservative, knee-jerk interventionalist movement to nation build, and then a reaction to that, which we've seen throughout history. Post-World War I, you saw an isolationism that delayed the involvement into World War II that could have stopped further aggression.
Wilson was a liberal internationalist, what they call, which is very similar to neocon in a sense that he too wanted to bring democracy to the world. The whole point of World War I was to end all wars and bring democracy and nation building to the world. So there's a theme there about interventionism in the name of altruism. Yeah, and I think the isolationism is a response to that, but falls into also a self-sacrificial trap, which is, we won't stand up for ourselves. We won't actually do the things that's actually necessary for us to defend ourselves in order to and go out and win wars.
A suicidal-like pacifism.
Economy, of course.
Yeah, a suicidal pacifism, which is also the elimination of self and self-interest. It's the same animating principle.
It might be useful just to put a contrast in here that I think is reinforcing of this point. So I'm arguing that it shapes both the people who want to wage wars, like the neocons, and the people who are more of the defeatist. But it also shapes the people who are thought to be, in the popular imagination, committed to America's self-interest. And I think it's interesting to think of Trump in this sense. Like, America first is whatever I say America first is. And his slogan is widely understood to be, it's just about American interest. And what I would point out to people here is to really think about, if your view of your interest is whatever you define it to be, as opposed to a matter of facts and evidence and thought and principle, then it's hollow, it's empty, it's just a vessel. It doesn't really have any identity. And the one thing that happens is that altruism corrupts people's thinking, not only in their own mind and how they act and what they are willing to do and not willing to do, but it gives them a caricature of what it means to be self-interested. So if what people think is actually an expression of America's self-interest is George W. Bush having a crusade for democracy, that is not what self-interest looks like. If they think it's Donald Trump who says, whatever I feel like today, that's America's interest, that is not what self-interest looks like. Self-interest is not defined by your feelings or your arbitrary claims. It's defined by fact in relation to your life and your freedom. And that takes a lot of thought, and it takes a lot of long-range thinking. And some of what we've been talking about, evaluating other countries, thinking about a political system, those are key aspects of what it means to think about one's interests. So altruism corrupts thinking both in terms of hampering our ability to act, robbing us of self-esteem, but also making it look like, yeah, if you act in your self-interest, it's suicidal. Who wants to look like that? Who wants to hold hands with Putin? Who wants to hold hands with the North Korean dictator? That is crazy. That is just mercenary. And it is, but that's not what, it's not right to think of it as self-interest. It's one of those things where people abuse and criticize self-interest, but they are criticizing the wrong thing. This is it's not even a caricature of self-interest. It's just completely not even in the same category.
He is pretty funny, though. I mean, Trump's a funny guy, but I give you that.
In a satirical sort of way, I suppose. But, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because there's like well, there are these. You still, if politics is about compared to what and about choices, right? I mean, there are elements within Trump's policy that he's willing to do certain things that he says he's going to do that I think in a lot of ways previous politicians, if you can imagine a Harris or a Biden administration currently, they say a lot of things and there's almost no action and there's no execution. Like we're, kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Are there certain things you can acknowledge that at least Trump asserts a little bit of America's self-interest and not caring about the approval of the world and prioritizing victory over approval?
I mean, I think what he cares about is the approval of not very smart people in the United States. So he definitely cares about approval of people. He's constantly battling for approval. You saw that now with Iran, right?
Well,
so
a lot of those not very smart people are the isolationists, like America first, get out of there.
Isolationist. I would include most of the people who adamantly support him in that category, whether they're isolationists or not. I'll give you an example. I mean, MAGA was split into two, right? There were those who said let's go bomb, and there were those who said, oh no, with a peace, right? And shouldn't intervene. And Trump, you have to give him credit. Right? He is a brilliant politician. Now, that's not a compliment. He managed.
It never is from Yaron.
He managed within 3 days to appease both of those groups and to make himself a hero to both of those groups. He bombed the Fordo and the other nuclear sites. So the intervention, the pro-interventionist guy said, yes, strong America, we're great. And then within 24 hours, he declares a ceasefire, which is not in America's self-interest. And then the peaceniks all going, yeah, you see, he really was for peace. And he managed to reunify MAGA. I mean, MAGA is probably stronger right now, than it's ever been before, because he managed to appease both groups. So, but is America better off as a consequence? And of course, all of this is not a consequence of Trump. It's a consequence of the fact that what Israel did was absolutely brilliant and unique in world history in terms of fighting a war. I mean, it's stunning if people really analyze what happened here. It truly is stunning. And I see everybody trying to undercut the success and undercut the achievement, but the achievement is amazing. And even there, Trump, again, he's good at this, right? These are the things he's good at. He didn't say yes to the attack and he didn't say no. He kind of played along. And in that way, if it failed, he could go, yeah, I mean, I was against it. I don't approve of this stuff. I'm for peace. And when it was succeeded, he literally put out a tweet saying, we control the skies above Iran. Not Israel controls them with American weapons. No, America controls the sky above Iran. So he took credit for it. So look, is he going to do stuff that is okay once in a while? Yeah. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem with it. I thought it was a good thing. But it's completely random. And tomorrow he could sign some kind of amazing deal with Iran that makes them, incredibly wealthy and gives them the capacity to reestablish their nuclear program. Right. He is just completely, you can't predict what it's
unreliable.
Unpredictability in a positive sense. Unpredictability in a very negative sense. You can't predict. And it's unprincipled. It's unhinged from reality. It's all inside his mind. And it's all focused on manipulating people. And the people he wants to manipulate is public opinion. He is a narcissist and he needs people to love him. And he would like the world to love him, and he's working on that. But he certainly has got a lot of Americans to be infatuated with him, and that to him is success.
Nasty guy, that Yaron Brook, taking me down. He's a fake news guy. But I would say, did you see elements of?
You got the accent down.
Well, I do. It's great. No, the Israel doing what it did militarily. Like, speaking of the aberration that was World War II, did you both, having been like making this case for so long, finally see an expression of rational self-interest on the world stage? Like, look at this. This is how a government, responsible government.
It was close, but
Come
it was
on, Yaron.
not fair.
On.
I mean,
what do they have to do?
Well, here's one. I mean, they would have had to take out the ability, if you want, to export oil.
Right.
I mean, and now Trump wouldn't allow that. I'm sure Trump didn't allow that, and the Chinese would be very unhappy. But that would have been, if they had taken out the oil refining capacity and the oil export capacity, which would not be difficult because there's basically one location.
Yeah.
I would have been, I would have given them an A+. But in spite of that, what they did is so amazing. And of course, they made sure to ultimately, they made sure to stop just in time, not for the regime, so to make sure the regime didn't actually collapse. So at the end, they didn't go all the way, but those first few days, I mean, wow, it was unbelievably impressive.
Yeah, I want to respond to that because I have a similar view, and maybe in the end it's the same. But I would point out that in certain tactical ways, this was excellent and it was impressive, and I think for the right reasons. So that particularly, and this is something my colleague and I were talking about in a different podcast, which is it's especially good that they struck when Iran was weakest, and it is the weakest it's been in a long time. And I think that's important as opposed to going after Iran at any other time when it would have been I think it's good that they weakened them by going after Hezbollah and Hamas and so on. So, and I think this to me is an example of Israel at its strongest militarily, but it's essentially a tactical win. It's not strategic. And I think one reason to think of it that way is, to me, the contrast is Gaza after October 7th. And now I wrote a book arguing that Israel, for secular individualist reasons, should be supported, and it's the right party in this conflict between the Palestinians. And yet I was looking at Israel after Gaza, October 7th and the war in Gaza, and it is just a repeat of all the mistakes they made in the past and worse, which is they're not really going after defeating Hamas. They dragged the war out. They haven't succeeded in eliminating this threat because Hamas is still in power. It's advertising that fact. Now it's obviously very weakened and so on, and Gaza is a lot of it is rubble. But I would have liked to see something a lot stronger in Gaza. And then it would have been a principled approach. Like, yeah, we go after our enemies, not only in Gaza, but also in Iran. And Iran is not an exception, as I think it is in this case. It was more the norm. And I think the other cases where I think they were tactically very strong is what they did with Hezbollah in Lebanon with the pagers and the walkie-talkies. That was just really, really high-level thinking and planning and long range kind of subterfuge. And that's impressive. And I think that suggests a conception of their interests that goes beyond the news cycle and beyond the next UN condemnation, which is part of the problem. But to me, is this the shape of things to come? I hope so. I think Israel suffers from the same kind of problems that America's foreign policy does, which is it's not really committed or doesn't have a firm conception of its self-interest.
And has moments of this assertion, and then every once in a while, then cycles back to the same toxic relationship of prioritizing Western approval
really
over victory.
In what happened in this war, in terms of, I think think about the Israeli response and the Iranian response. All the Iranians can do is lob a bunch of dumb missiles into population areas and hope that some of them hit, and they don't know what they're hitting. They have no clue what they're hitting. And it's exactly that. This is a bunch of theocratic mystical religionists versus a society built on the human mind. precision weaponry. They knew where everybody was sleeping, never mind where everybody was. They faked them. They faked the one group into a bunker, and then they bombed the bunker to kill them. I mean, everything was thought out. I mean, what you got in the contrast was thinking versus Allah will take care of us or something. And in that extent, it was just such an amazing, inspiring demonstration of what the human mind is capable of in the context of war. They decided, and I think maybe correctly, that the Iranian population was actually a significant portion of them was actually on their side, and that they could bring down this regime without harming a significant number of the Iranians. And we could debate whether that's the right thing to do or not, but I think it was a reasonable assumption to make. And then they went after the regime itself in a just brilliant fashion. Now, they could have done more, and it should have lasted another couple of weeks, and all of that. And again, we have to remember this: Iran is far away from Israel. I mean, this is and Israel does not have B-2s or B-29s even. World War II bombers. They don't have big airplanes that can fly thousands of miles. They're doing this with F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s that are not designed for long distance combat. And yet they made changes to the design of the F-35 so it can fly to Iran and back without refueling. They had refueling planes because they dominated the airspace. They took out, over months, they took out, the ground to air capacity of both Syria and then of Iran. So, the thinking here and the difference between the two regimes, that has to be, that should be the number one thing that people focus on, because it illustrates what a free country can do and why Israel's virtuous, because it's free and it's a country of thinkers, versus the barbarism and primitivism of the Iranian regime, which is focused on religion and building big, dumb bombs.
And they still can't figure out how to get plastic cups right, and they're sweeping streets with squeegees and hot water in the streets of Israel. But having said that, the technological innovation is a little levity here. It's getting heavy. But I definitely think nothing embodies sort of the moral and
some criticism of Israel when we're talking about this stuff.
But the virtuistic difference, is certainly very apparent in how the two nations have fought. Just to button up the subject, because we kind of went in reverse order. I'm trying, one of the things we've tried to do on the podcast is look at the pulse of just how general population is perceiving this, because when they don't see an attack on American soil, a lot of times some people will say, well, it's Israel's war, right? And we can demonstrate clearly why Israel has a right to attack and defend itself against Iran. But, at the end of all this, you see popular comedians, podcasters, Dave Smith, for example, tweets today, my position was that Trump and the Israelis launched a war of aggression and choice that had a high risk of turning into a catastrophe and zero benefit for the American people. I'm thrilled that the Iranians showed restraint and Trump seized the opportunity to push a ceasefire, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like a tweet like this is the complete inversion of everything we're discussing here, which is framing Iran as this innocent bystander when, Elan, you pointed out that for decades, they, of course, have been threatening and exercising attacks against Israel, aggression against Israel, and the United States in kind of inspiring these movements that have built up a whole hostility and culture of aggression to attack United States.
It's funding.
And funding,
it's organizing. It's helping them plan. They bombed the Koba Tower in Saudi Arabia. That was an Iranian intelligence operation executed by Hezbollah, a different Hezbollah. This is the Iraqi Hezbollah, but still, it's Iranian intelligence. Where I can't remember, 16 Americans died over and over and over again. This is not. Oh yeah, we're just inspiring. They're definitely inspiring. And inspiring entities that are Sunni primarily. But in the Shiite, in the Hezbollah world, where a lot of Americans have died because of Hezbollah, going back to Beirut and other places around the world, this is more than inspiring. This is Iranian planning and execution. And even Hamas, which is a Sunni organization, they were there to help with October 7th. They made it possible. They funded it, and they were involved in the planning of it. So, it's not just inspiration. This is actual action. Iran itself has the blood of hundreds of American lives on its hands directly. So, not and the building they were planning to build ICBMs. Why do they need intercontinental ballistic missiles? They need ICBMs because they want to go after America. Mm-hmm. So this, they chant hate to America, death to America every Friday at the mosque. This is not just symbolic because they've executed on it. So people say, oh, you're going to bomb them because they chant something. No, they chanted. The difference is they mean it, and they've shown that they mean it.
So it actually sounds like, and either of you can comment on this, it kept, the story was that the nuclear arsenal, developing a nuclear weapon, was the red line. But it sounded like that red line was crossed years and years and years ago. They were just never willing to execute on it, Israel or the United States. If this is if they've always been aggressors against us.
1979 when they took the embassy, that was the red line.
Yeah.
I think the one way I would put this that might be helpful is it's not the weapons, it's the regime and the ideology that they act on. That's the problem. Iran should have been removed from power years ago, hopefully by its own people, and if not by America in reaction to the acts of aggression against it. Mm-hmm. We don't worry about France having nuclear weapons because we don't think the French are theocratic, crazy people who want to kill us. It's Iran is that, and we've been lying to ourselves and lying to the rest of the world about what is the nature of this regime. If Iran were like France, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's the weapons are just means by which they try to inflict harm, guided by their ideology.
Right.
On that note, before we move on, Yaron, you mentioned taking down the regime. If let's say they took out they took out the regime and there was nothing better to replace it, where are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there is such a thing as nothing better to replace it. Mm-hmm. First of all, you can't get a lot worse than the Iranian regime. This is about as bad as it gets. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, as we saw with the Gold Revolution and with previous demonstrations, there are many people in Iran who would like some semblance of a kind of a Western liberal democracy. Exactly what it looks like, I don't know. It would be far from perfect, but it would be a lot better than what we have today. There's one group, there's one Marxist Islamist group that is one of the opposition groups, but they're not going to go back to Islamism when they take out this regime. So how do you get worse? What people said, there'll be a civil war. Maybe, but why is that worse, right? I mean, if they end up killing each other, then so be it. It would be sad for the innocent Iranians. It would be sad for the better people. But it will definitely make Israel safer and the United States safer if they're busy killing each other in a civil war. They'll all escape and go to Europe or whatever. You'll have another refugee crisis. Okay, well, deal with that. We can deal with the refugee crisis, prevent them from moving into Europe. There's just no, I think, scenario that suggests. I mean, it reminds me, before the war started, it was going to be World War III. And then regime change was going to create chaos. There's that word, chaos. And chaos is somehow bad. But why, chaos is bad for the people in the chaos, certainly. But why is it bad for us that there's chaos in Iran? So there's just no basis for any negative assessment around regime change. And I'm not even for regime change. I'm for destroying this regime and let them figure out what they want after that. As long as they learn that they don't mess with Israel and the United States.
And regime change, you see, like this regime no longer being in power is the only true victory.
It would be wonderful if Iran had a kind of moderate pro-Western government. They signed a peace deal with Israel and kumbaya. I mean, that would be phenomenal. And I think it's quite possible. I think we were really close to that. I don't think it's that far away. But that's not the point. The point is get rid of this regime, make them really pay, make it clear what the consequences of, starting a war with Israel and the United States are. How many should be dead? The entire, most of that, religious council that appoints the next supreme leader. Any country with a supreme leader has to be a little suspect. We're not living in a cartoon of, superheroes, supreme leader. So they should have gone after political institutions, not only after military. but again, I think Trump held them back. I think Israel would have done that. I think Trump was holding them back. They went after. I mean, I was surprised with Hezbollah that in the end they went after Nasrallah, right? Because Nasrallah was viewed as untouchable because of his kind of spiritual role or whatever, and they did it. So they might have gone after Khamenei, if not for the United States.
I want to add to what was raised here, because if you go back 3-4 years, the Iranians were in the streets in numbers we have never seen before, maybe only since the revolution. And what they were in the streets about is the dictatorial treatment of women who were taking off their headscarves and who said, we don't want to live under a regime that tells women how to dress and beats them up for it and kills them in the police stations. If you remember, the uprisings arose because a young woman was arrested and she died in custody. Her name was, I think it was Amina.
Mamash, something. Yeah.
Yeah. So the name will come back to me in a moment, but that was a turning point. It wasn't the first opportunity for the Iranians to push their regime out. There was another opportunity like that under the Green Revolution or Green Movement under Obama. And the reason I mention both of these is that these were both cases where significant just moral support, encouragement, and endorsement from free countries like the United States, like Israel, would have done enormous good to those movements. And maybe you would even honor them. Maybe you'd even train them. Maybe you'd give them some support in other ways so that they can liberate themselves from their oppressors. Now, that would be a good thing. And I don't think you have to do all the things. The critical thing here is giving people who are trying to build a better society moral support. That goes a long way. Just talk to the people who lived under the Polish autocracy during the Cold War, and what Reagan's words, which are not that strong, but they were important enough, they inspired people. And that really goes a long way. So to me, that was an opportunity years ago. And when you think about what happens when a regime collapses, forgotten are the people who go into the streets over the last few years who wanted a better regime. Those are the people that would be the foundation of a better society. And those are important things to keep in mind. And then the last small point I would make here is that Yaron was rightly applauding Israel's brilliant military campaign and their planning. I don't think it's gotten enough attention that Israel did two things which I thought were really, really positive. They hacked the Iranian broadcasting network, one of the TV stations, and they rebroadcast video clips from the uprisings 2-3 years ago, the women freedom uprisings, where Iranians, not only women, but Iranians from all walks of life went into the streets to oppose the regime. And I think that's a message to the Iranians. That's you at your best, and we're creating some room for you. I think that's part of why they hacked the TV and they broadcast that. And the second thing they did is they bombed the gates of Evin prison, which is notorious for torture. And it's the home, it's where they throw political prisoners, basically. It's the dungeon where they put their regime enemies. Now, that is another signal. That's saying there are people in here who would be much more, they need not to be in here. They need to be liberated. And if you think about to your question, Michael, what would happen if the regime collapses, whether that's because of the retaliatory strikes from Israel or if it just implodes from other reasons? There are those kinds of people who could and should be encouraged to step in and form a better society. Now, that might be difficult. It is never easy, but that's
I guess my real question is, why wasn't there an uprising? Because I was expecting one from where I was sitting.
Why there wasn't what?
Why wasn't there an uprising?
Well,
ultimately?
because the Iranians couldn't hit Israel. They couldn't do anything there. They really had nothing else to do but put out their troops into the streets. And by all accounts, they were armed. They were arresting. If you're an Iranian foreigner who was commenting on Twitter, they arrested their families.
Oh wow!
They put people in every corner, in every major intersection. They were armed guards. They had soldiers everywhere. Remember, the Iranian opposition is unarmed, and the question is going to be what happens the next month or two. Right. Now that the bombing has stopped, And most of the population of Tehran left. Well, not most, but a third of the population left. 5 million people left Tehran during this period. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now when they come back, when the dust settles a little bit, and they really realize how weak this regime is. What they do, but yeah, I think again, Israel was just starting to eliminate large numbers of Revolutionary Guard personnel and the personnel that suppress riots, the Baji, something like that they're called, and they killed supposedly 700 people the day before the ceasefire was 700 soldiers the day before, and they were attacking. I mean, the biggest bombings of Tehran happened the day before the ceasefire. This is when they blew out the prison door. I mean, this was the beginning. And when Iran violated the ceasefire and Israel sent jets over and they were ready to bomb again, they were flying over Tehran as Netanyahu and Trump were talking on the phone. And Trump was saying, bring those planes back. And, they were ready to again attack regime installations and institutions above Tehran. And unfortunately, they were forced to come back. But if that had gone on for a few more days, and if the Iranian population had been more confident that some of these elements that suppress them and kill them had been, eliminated, who knows? But it's very difficult. Oh, the other thing is, all these revolutions, when people go out in the streets in modern times, have been organized through the internet. Internet was down for a lot of this. It was difficult for people to communicate. So, and
come on, Starlink.
Well, remember, Elon Musk turned on Starlink, but in order to actually access Starlink, you have to have a receiver on your side. Right. And I hope now lots of those receivers will be smuggled in for the next time, but they didn't have the receivers, so the receivers were not really there. But we will see over the next couple of months if they go out in the streets or not. But remember, this is one of the most brutal regimes ever. They have no problem killing people in the streets. They have no problem with torturing. If you've seen when they hang them from cranes so that everybody can see them way up high. It's not hanging them in a private prison cell or something. These are public executions on a massive scale. This is a barbaric and really violent regime, and people are cautious and they're afraid, and they should be afraid.
Elan, I also think back to what you said about the moral support, which is easy to do in a sense, the gesturing, because the inverse of that was the sort of immoral support, or you could say the moral support that Iran, since the revolution, had been providing on the flip side. I know it wasn't just inspiring things, but even that, like you're saying, is very consequential to inspire one movements in one direction. So on the contrary, by the same token, Western support for Western ideals, for free ideals, goes a long way as well. I
agree with that, but I would make it the point even stronger. I would say that the power of a morally righteous free society speaking up in defense of its own ideals and encouraging other people to embrace them and being an exemplar insofar as we can live up to our own, that is just way, way underrated and undervalued. And the people that you hear in American political life talking about how America is supposed to be supportive of free peoples, they have no clue what that looks like. So imagine you were asking about earlier, are there good things that Trump's doing? And we went around different aspects of that. What would it look like for an American president to stand up and explain? It doesn't have to be a lecture. It's just like 5 minutes explanation. Here's the history. Here's why they're in the wrong. Here's the kind of regime they are. Here's why they terrorize and they're at war with their own people. Then they're at war with Israel. And they've been at war with us for decades. Make a case. And then say, we are speaking now not only in explanation of our own actions in self-defense, but we are speaking to all those people in Iran. And the woman who died, Masa Amini, whose name I forgot, and I want to make sure it's in the record, we're speaking out for all those people in Iran who want to be free. We stand with you. The world's freest, most powerful country stands with you. And if you can get that message to people, and you can broadcast different planes, you can drop leaflets, there's all sorts of ways to get people. That could be the spark that ignites a positive change in a country like that. And it
seems
way
like
more
Netanyahu
powerful.
was trying to do that.
And the West has clearly betrayed them.
Yeah.
Because you didn't hear Trump say that once. Netanyahu flirted with it a few times, but didn't. But he could have said it a lot stronger.
Yeah.
But it really needed to come from Trump. It needed to come from the leader of the United States.
And
the support for free Iran, and quite the contrary. Trump said, ultimately said, we do not want regime change. We don't want chaos. And that is about as weak as you could say it.
And here's why, just to put a punctuation point on this, here's why it's more powerful than what Iran was doing in inspiring and motivating Islamists. The ideals of freedom, of individualism, of capitalism, they're true and they're moral and they're things to embrace and they make life good. That's what makes them valuable. We've seen how much Yaron's point about Israel as embodying a society, or its military conduct as embodying a society built on the power of the mind, the rational mind, and the thoughtful. That is what America really represents. That's what free societies represent. That's what they unleash. They leave people free to achieve and prosper and innovate and build and create. That's what should inspire and attract everyone who really values their life. And wherever those people are, whether they're in dictatorships or religious theocracies like Iran, this is what the selling point is. We don't have to convince them. We can just say, you could have a good life like ours. Like the standard of living in the West today it's just hard for people to appreciate how valuable it is and how advanced it is. And what makes that possible is the remnants of freedom that we still have in the United States. So imagine if we said,
not
this
in New
is
York
available
City.
to you. Say that again?
I said not in New York City, but we can talk about that maybe as a bonus.
Yeah,
clip,
that could be a
just happened.
follow-up conversation if you want.
It's a whole other episode. My God. All right. I wanted, before we wrap up, there's an interesting point that's somewhat related, but it's sort of like adjacent to this. Michael and I talk about a lot about anti-Semitism and how it's sort of this unapologetic form of it has just like been this wellspring, of course, online, probably a little bit disproportionate online to real life. But do you think there's any kind of, and either one of you can chime in here, of a relationship between these ideas that have formed in the isolationist echo chambers, between anti-Semitism and isolationism, or the way they frame the relationship of Israel to the United States in this controlling, behind the scenes, luring America into all of these foreign entanglements as if America has no agency, but there's this secret hidden cabal, but we'll code it in foreign policy language and foreign aid language that we're against. And it seems to just be, and I don't like to throw the term around lightly because it's a kind of low resolution accusation that's often used on the far left, but when I see it now, it's very hard to deny that there's been this, I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about the history of this relationship between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, isolationism, American foreign policy.
I mean, this is what happens. And again, I'll go back to Trump's 2016 campaign, right? What was the essence of his campaign? America is failing. It's horrific stuff, carnage in the streets of America. America is a disaster. And who is at fault? The other. It's the immigrants, it's the Mexicans, it's the Chinese, it's elites, which is often code name for you know whom, and it's the other. And who's going to solve it? I am. And the point here is every thug in history has used the other as a scapegoat to explain failure. And this is something that exists and permeates throughout Western society, sadly, or societies generally. Given how great America is in these people's minds, right? Great. How did it fail in Iraq and Afghanistan? How did they get into this mess? How did they do these stupid things? There has to be somebody at fault, and that fault is never us. It's always the other. And who's the other here? Well, the other throughout history, really since the crucifixion, the other has been the Jew. Trump couldn't say it in 2016, and maybe doesn't believe it. I don't want to say that Trump's an anti-Semite, but the other's always been a Jew throughout Western history. And so who's to blame? And it's convenient that most neoconservatives are Jewish. It's convenient that Israel is in the Middle East. But any American failure is going to be blamed on the Jews as a scapegoat. And the origins of that have to do with Israel's success and the Jews' success and the hatred of that success, again driven by altruism but also, look, this has deep roots in Christianity. We might live in a relatively secular culture, but we have not shrugged off those deep Christian roots that include, among them, a real hatred of Jews.
And even the stuff that's not Jewish, like immigration, it's caused by leftist Jews. Like it's a Gad Sad had this famous thing,
Absolutely.
5 degrees of separation, Joe, from blaming the Jew. And he literally, any policy they don't like, well, there's a Jew behind it. Yep. So it's fascinating how obvious it is that they serve it to us on a silver platter of what's animating this.
I want to add to just some texture to what Yaron's raising, because I think there's another factor that's worth acknowledging, which might be, this is part of where my thinking is, and I'm still developing this view. Another factor that helps explain why it's more salient and more self-righteous now is that I think there's anti-Semitism is akin to a kind of conspiracy theory mentality or conspiracy fantasy mentality. It's like it's explaining things by forces you can't see, but they're really there. If you think about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or Jews control the banks, Jews control the media, Jews took us into the Iraq War. There's a whole book about that. This whole thing, Jews were behind 9/11. It's a conspiracy mentality. Now, I'm not saying every anti-Semitic person has this, but they often overlap. And it's interesting. And I think one reason those kinds of mentalities become more salient is that there's a kind of intellectual bankruptcy where people don't know how to make sense of things. And I think 9/11 is a prime example. And some of the other crises we've gone through, like the financial crisis and COVID, is like, what the F is going on in this country? And this is something Yaron's been talking about in other contexts, which is the more people feel out of control, the more they look for explanations that are not good explanations, but they fit an emotional disposition, or they fit some prejudice. And one of them is a kind of anti-Semitic theme. The globalists are behind it. George Soros is behind it. I don't know what George Soros is doing. It's very unlikely he's behind everything he's claimed to be. Right. Now, I think that's an aspect of the problem, but I think Yaron's analysis of it, sort of the philosophical roots of it, is central. And in order to understand the sort of self-righteousness of it is a secondary thing, which is the mainstreaming of it, which has happened. Right. It was sort of in the shadows for a long time, in the last 30 years or so, but then in the last 10 years, I think it's become just more self-righteous and out of the shadows into the mainstream. And I suspect part of that is there's just growing racial and group identity in the last 15 to 20 years. There's no doubt about that. The woke phenomenon was just one expression of it. Before that, there's other expressions of it. And then you get it on all sides of the plate. Like MAGA is a kind of group identity. I mean, there's no way around that. It's not essentially ethnic, but it is a group identity. And I think all of that makes people look for which group's screwing us, right? Because if we're all in groups and we're not happy, somebody's screwing us.
And Jews conveniently never quite fit into those identitarian constructs. They always fall victim to be the scapegoat of either one. So no matter where the pendulum swings, Jews find themselves, on the receiving end of the animosity, for whether it's you're a Zionist or you're a globalist, depending on which side is coming after you. Well, those were some fascinating answers. I wanted to wrap up on just sort of the real culprit of kind of explaining all this chaos. It feels like we're in this sort of Tower of Babel moment. No one can even understand each other. These conversations happen cross purposes online. And I've always found that from the objectivist perspective, the real problem comes down to not politics, not ethnicity, but or even group identity, but beneath that, philosophy, ideology, and irrationality. When irrationality is run amok, it infects everybody, and then that's why we see all these reaction things. Can we just to wrap up here, like both of you say a little bit about that role of whether people like it or not, or know it or not, or are aware of it, you are motivated by philosophy or a lack thereof, and it leads to the chaotic environment that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're all driven by a set of ideas, and those ideas are internalized for most people unconsciously. They absorb it from the culture around them. It's in their attitudes. It shapes their emotions. It shapes their conclusions, their cognition, what they think. They don't have principles. They haven't really thought through what those principles are, what actually shapes themselves and what they think shapes the world. And in a sense, they're just moved by events. And they look for explanations either in what is conventional, in either what is mainstream and what kind of everybody thinks it's safe to be there, or if you're kind of, if you're a rebel, I guess, then you look for explanations of some crazy, wacky conspiracy theory. But what we've really done a very poor job of in the West over the last few decades is looking at explanations in reality by using reason and using our mind. At the end of the day, the challenges we face in the world are epistemological in a sense that people can't think. They don't think for themselves. They don't actually use their mind to try to explain the world, and they refuse to accept principles as any kind of guide for their own actions. And we are a consequence of the philosophy we live in. If you reject reason, if you reject individualism, then you will reject kind of the kind of foreign policy that we're advocating for, and you will start embracing systems that are politically unfree.
Mm-hmm. And Elan, I want to hear your thought as well, but also just to keep in mind, why is it so difficult for these kind of principles, objectivist ideas, to sort of find their way into mainstream politics? We just saw what happened with the mayoral race in New York last night. We're right outside New York, and to see the return of the same old socialist ideas that find their way, aside from all the anti-Israel stuff and anti-Semitism stuff, just on the socialism alone, the lure, the seductive nature of these things, they just keep rinsing, repeating, and then someone else gets into power who botches all the free market principles. So why does that have if these ideas are true and resonant, as you said before, why is there such a struggle to mainstream them?
I'll just offer a comment here and hand it to you, Yaron, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is socialism was discredited politically, economically, but the moral foundations of socialism are the same moral foundations as religion, and religion is still with us, and it's this altruistic morality of serving other people as the moral ideal. That hasn't gone away. People are not willing to challenge those kinds of views. They're not even willing to question them, and that's why you get this sort of, why are there socialists still around? Why are there collectivists? Why are there nationalists still around? Like, if World War II didn't discredit nationalism, I don't know what could. And that's because fundamentally people are operating on moral and philosophical ideas that they're unaware of, or they're not willing to recognize and question. And that's the premise that Ayn Rand brings that's unique, which is recognize the role of philosophy in human life is to recognize that we're moved by ideas, and our choice is which ideas we accept. Do we make them, do we choose rational ones, or do we choose irrational ones? And do we integrate them into a coherent whole to serve our life and achieve things, or do we leave them at the mercy of chance and whatever we pick up in the culture? And to me, that's people don't have a concept of what philosophy is, and they don't recognize its power over them, but it doesn't change the fact that it has this power over them. It's just, it's as true as the fact of gravity, that we're moved by philosophical ideas. I would say one thing to address your audience, if they're curious about this, they want to understand more, I'd recommend that they explore Ayn Rand's own works on this. A lot of her essays are available on our website, aynrand.org, AYNRAND.org. But I would also say, if they want to dive deeper, thanks to the generosity of our donors, we offer free copies of our books to students everywhere, basically, that you can get it. And you're welcome to pick up her classic Atlas Shrugged novel, Fountainhead, and some of her nonfiction to really understand it in your own firsthand perspective. And she has, the way she presents these points is so much more powerful than what I've summarized here. And
would she be okay with her books being given away for free? I mean, no profit? Come on, guys. No.
I can answer that, but I'm not sure if you're being serious or being comedian.
Most of the time it's joking, but I know it's in the self-interest to spread these ideas and have more people understand objectivism. Of course. Okay, good. So you can find your works there at, what was the website again? Just to
AYNRAND.org.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that Michael wraps up a really insightful discussion on this. overall, going to war for your own self-defense is justified. That doesn't apply in every scenario. And I think it helped break down a little bit of this confusing landscape we find ourselves in with all these reactionary people with takes about these things. But providing some philosophy and insight to ground us was very, very helpful. So thank you, gentlemen. Yaron Brook and Elan Journo. We very much appreciate your time.
Very refreshing. Thank you, guys.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Michael.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.